We're live on a Friday. This is YouTube. I am Rich Lieberman, the Bay Area Media Pulse, and it is a pleasure to be with you as always. Welcome aboard, those of you watching live on YouTube, those of you who are watching at a later date, a more convenient time, we welcome you aboard. Also, frequently I get questions about who are my favorites on KGO radio. And that's a tough question because I like pretty much everybody. I mean, there was obviously many, many standouts. I've mentioned Ron Owens. That's kind of when I began really listening in earnest to KGO back in the mid 70s. I was a little kid and I actually listened well before that time. If you want to go way, 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 way back when I was a little kid, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. But I remember people like Ira Blue and Jim Dunbar. In fact, I remember the day very vividly that Jim Dunbar was working the studio. And that was when they had a glass studio outside Golden Gate Avenue. You can actually look into the studio where they were broadcasting. And way, 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 way back in 1972, Jim Dunbar was shot at. And that resulted in KGO eventually going to it was cool, but it was kind of spooky, an inner bunker at the old studio where KGO television was located at 277 Golden Gate Avenue, a place where I really kind of got to know Ron very well. And Ron was very, very nice to me. Let me come into the studio, featured me on Rock Trivia, which was one of the features that he did on Fridays. And well, pretty soon I was very, very lucky, and I got to meet a lot of the KGO people at the time. No idea that it would turn into the mega station, the legacy station that it eventually would become, and how some of the great, great broadcasters, talk show hosts, what have you, people like Dunbar, Ted Wygant, Joe Starkey in sports, and Harv Morgan and Peter Cleveland, the great radio reporter and television reporter, and hosts like Art Finley. They called him Mayor Art. Obviously, Ron Owens, who started in San Francisco around November 1975. We're coming up on the 50-year anniversary. And, of course, Ray Taliaferro, Bob Treber, Noah Griffin. It was really an absolute treasure of a radio station. And I want to mention two today, specifically, who provided a great joy, not only to me, but millions of Bay Area listeners. And I got to interview both these guys, fortunately. And I'm talking about Bill Wattenberg, the most talented guy I've ever heard, who can mix science and engineering and politics and make it into one of the most interesting radio shows. And Bill was fantastic. I'll get to Bill in a second. Then there was also the great Lee Rodgers. And Lee Rodgers was, as advertised, a real interesting person, compelling and profoundly, just like I said, interesting. Now, on politics, a few topics that I agreed with Lee Rodgers, but mostly I didn't agree with a lot of Lee Rodgers. He was extremely conservative. But as I've said here many a times, you get me to listen, and I'm interested in somebody who's talented. And, Lee was so talented and he was so infinitely listenable to that I forgot his politics. And I just he was so good. His talent superseded his politics, which at the time I wasn't too crazy about, except his feelings about the Middle East, which I agreed with totally. And Lee would migrate from KGO over to KSFO, and he would become the morning guy at what was once one of the most esteemed radio stations, not just in the Bay Area, but the entire country, and that was KSFO and the likes of. And I wasn't around for Gene Nelson. I listened to Gene Nelson, but there was just an incredible show in the morning with Lee, and he co-hosted with Melanie Morgan, and just an incredible show. Before I get back to Lee, though, I want to talk about Wattenberg, and I'll let you know why I think Wattenberg was so fantastic. And I mentioned other talk show hosts that certainly contributed to the kind of culture that KGO became, not just, as I said, in the Bay Area, but beyond. And certainly we in the Bay Area were very, very privy to this lineup of talent. Wattenberg was in a league of his own. And those of you that listened know what I'm talking about. First of all, smart. They used to make a joke of the line was Bill Wattenberg is the smartest man on radio. And he was. And, his personality, as charming as ever, it was kind of a gruffy, kind of an old guy, get off my lawn. I'm laughing because I miss him dearly, and but he knew everything. He was an engineer, went to Cal, taught at Cal Berkeley, knew everything about all of this. These infernos that we have had over the years, these big, huge forest fires, and Bill, to his credit, God, I wish he was alive today to talk about all these fires that we've had, because Bill was the expert. He could talk about the timber industry and how we screwed up because we let the eucalyptus trees and all the forests get massively overgrown and all that. And he had this just consistent tone about why and how we would eventually pay for our misdeeds. And boy, was he right, was he not? And I didn't even agree with him at the time. Frankly, I didn't even care because he was so interesting to listen to. And he could be charming. He could be really mean and downright rude, which frankly led to his charm. I remember many a times he'd open up the show, and he usually did 10 to 1, 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. on KGO, both Saturday and Sunday. And he would fill in and do occasional morning shows during the week and fill in for Ron and fill in for various talk show hosts. But his Saturday, Sunday program was, you talk about appointment listening, was Wattenberg. Talked about the forest fires, talked about our situation that would come back to haunt us, talked about Bart, talked politics. God, the guy was so damn good, part of the KGO lineage. It was a pleasure. And I say, even when he was cranky, which he was a lot, and I don't know, people thought it was shtick. It wasn't. The guy was just that kind of a guy. And sometimes he would broadcast from his place up on the High Sierra. He did a remote broadcast in his cabin up near the Sierra and talk about anything. It could be anything, politics, and he would crack me up, folks. I would fall on the floor, literally laughing my ass off. Like he'd get some guy from Berkeley, right? And the guy sounded like a young kid, and Wattenberg would hone in on these kind of calls. And he would I'm going to try to do a Bill Wattenberg impression. So there'd be like a guy that would call and he'd be saying these nonsensical, stupid things, and not even, it didn't have to be a political view. He was just talking gibberish or stupid or whatever. And Wattenberg would hey, you punk, you've been smoking some dope tonight. Get off your ass. That was Bill Wattenberg. I'm laughing now because you'd have to hear it to believe it. I know people out there know what I'm talking about because they listened. And it was 3 hours that zoomed by real fast. And, what was great about Wattenberg was he not only could talk like that, he can also be very philosophical. His politics were ultra right, but very, very common sense approach. And I mentioned, for my money, I think the only guy that could talk to Dr. Edwin Teller, the H bomb guy, the father of the H bomb, Wattenberg was tight with Teller. Tight with Teller. That sounds like a movie or something, a book. But he could talk about that. He talked about nuclear power. He would, defend PG&E, but not in the manner in which you think. He was just a joy to listen to and funny. And even when he was cranky, he was funny. And my God, just worth the price of admission, which was zero. And that's what made KGO so great. They had these compelling people on that. And I didn't mention every host. I forgot Jim Easton. Shame on me. A guy that I also got to interview. But Wattenberg was in a league of his own. But back to Rodgers. I got to interview Lee Rodgers. Tragically, I was the last person to interview Rodgers, which I did down in a radio station down in Santa Cruz before he passed away. He was having a procedure done, and tragically, he passed away. This is like about, I don't know, 10 years ago. But Lee Rodgers was fantastic. Command of the English language, command of being a broadcaster. Forget talk show host. He was, ladies and gentlemen, again, those of you that listened to Lee Rodgers, started out in this market on the overnight. Then he walked his way from 7 to 10 p.m. on KGO. And then he left KGO, went to KSFO, and, did some shows there. And he took over the morning show after Gene Nelson left. And I didn't agree with most of his politics, but he was so damn good to listen. And he would speak in terms of being a broadcaster. And he had great interaction with Melanie Morgan. Now, you could argue about whether or not Melanie Morgan's politics were this way or that way or in the middle or whatever. Also, I didn't agree with anything that Melanie stood for. In fact, sometimes she was very annoying, but you know what? You listened because she was listenable. They made a great, great pair. And Lee was just unique. He was consistent. He had on professors. He'd have on Washington pundits. He would talk about the Middle East. He'd talk about local people. He would berate and get very, very nasty in a decent way, if that makes any kind of sense, with people that he disagreed with. And he could get downright angry and hostile. Again, was doing it from the heart. There was no shtick. It wasn't being a shock and awe guy for the sake of drawing listeners or ratings. That was Lee Rodgers. That's what made him so fantastic. There was no manufactured or crapola. It was all right here. It's from the heart. And what made KGO so indelible. And mind you, this was a guy that came from Chicago. So he was that kind of familiar, sort of argumentative type of personality, which he was. And you didn't have to agree with his politics. I didn't. People, that's often they think it's contradictory. It isn't. I've heard some of the most incredibly boring people who, frankly, their politics I agreed with, but they're boring. Remember Air America, which didn't last long? Oh my God, boy, were they great. They were great. They were great. Well, guess what? They flunked too. They went out of business. Most of the people there had politics, which at the time, I say at the time, I was pretty much for the par and the course and all that stuff. Yet they were a snooze, which was completely the opposite case with Lee Rodgers, and especially his views on the Middle East. and he, like Wattenberg, was on the forest fires that would come down and eventually haunt us with our policy on, the Sierra Club, and keeping and letting trees grow endlessly and all that. Well, Lee was pretty damn good during the very, very tragic times preceding 9/11, and telling us about what was going to come back and haunt us, and that was our passivity, or is it passiveness? I think I just made up a word, but whatever, regarding what would be our ultimate enemy in the Middle East, and how they would come and do something to us that we didn't see coming and caught us off guard, which of course was 9/11. I don't know. That's another subject altogether. My point is Lee Rodgers understood the situation. He wasn't, shall we say, he wasn't, what's the word I'm trying to think of? He didn't flinch a moment and wasn't threatened by saying what the obvious was, and that we would get intimidated. Well, Lee wasn't intimidated. He didn't give a damn. And I'm not going to get into that because I don't want to start a topic in and of itself. But my point is, forget all of that. You turned on the radio, and Lee knew how to move the needle. And let me tell you something else, which oftentimes people forgot or didn't notice. Lee, I say, became the morning person at KSFO. And the show started around 5 in the morning, went from 5 until 9. Lee would get to the studio at midnight, and he would sit there and do prep work and research, and he would read all the sites, the USA Today, and the National Review, and the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle, all those sites. Talk about preparing. Well, that's what Lee did. He'd get there at midnight, take a little nap, and would go on the air at 5 o'clock in the morning till 9. So talk about preparation. He wasn't somebody who would show up at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock and do a regular, I'm losing it today, folks. A hit from 5 to 9. This guy was there 9 hours. And that was a rarity, and he very rarely mentioned it. He did mention it every now and then. I thought to myself, what the hell is this guy doing? Was he sleeping at the station? And no, he was prepping to do his show. And he took it so seriously. And by the way, they were number one, KSFO was. They were number one, and it was just a great, great show to listen to. Didn't agree with most of the politics. Too ultra right wing for my taste. I've become a lot more conservative because of circumstances, because of what the world is like these days. In any event, he was a masterful host, great interviewer, didn't mind telling you that if he disagreed with an interviewee, he would challenge them. It was no kiss ass, I'm here going to plug a book on morning San Francisco radio, and the guy's going to let me do it. Nah, not the case with Lee Rodgers. And they were fantastic. He and Bill Wattenberg, two of my favorite talk show hosts, was to me the greatest radio station that I'd ever listened to, and certainly a station that is gone today, regrettably, by a company that killed both these stations. And I don't even want to get into that. You know what I mean? And those of you that have read me and listened to me over the years, well, what a miscarriage of radio justice, of broadcast justice, that killed the mighty KGO radio. Bill Wattenberg and Lee Rodgers, fantastic hosts, good people, and great, great broadcast voices. Thank you for watching, and we will see you later. Hey, do me a favor, become a paid subscriber to my channel. or my blog, and also like me and tell your friends and enemies to watch me talk about media in this town and beyond.